the state corrective education self-assessment that was published as a result of that Dear Colleague letter, and it is essentially a checklist. And that checklist says these are the things that you're responsible for making sure that these agencies around the state are implementing, so that your districts are doing that your agencies are doing that, and that they're doing it responsibly. So again, it's set into two separate pieces. Obviously, I shared a little bit earlier on and can share again right now just to make sure that everybody has it, because I know Teams gets a little bit funny where this is concerned. I want to share over in the chat just a copy of all this so that you have this. This will be a clickable link. There's some clickable links in the document, but this is a PDF version of this presentation, so this will have an active link. That will link you to the document that shows you specifically what we were told that we needed to monitor, and as a result, that's what we monitor in the district. So general supervision and public agency requirements. So let's start, and we're going to go through each of these GS, general supervision, and PA requirements. And I'm going to highlight some of the things that we have seen over the last couple years that are vitally important to make sure that when we're coming in to look, if you find out if you have had a visit, if you're going to have a visit, this is 100% what we're looking for. We're not hiding anything. We're not veiling anything. And this is all at the direction of the federal government. This is not KDE making a decision to come into your district because we want to. This is because we have that general supervision responsibility that we have to complete. So, indicator GS1. And again, I would encourage you, if you have questions, please feel free, put them over in the chat, and I'll try to address them either as we go or at the end. So the first item is, and if you were in the other session a little bit earlier, you heard me talk about this. This is the transition one. Is the student beginning, for the ARC meetings, is the student beginning at age 14 invited to the meeting whenever appropriate, and unless there's an applicable exception, to attend if the purpose will be consideration of post-secondary goals and transition services needed to assist the student in reaching those goals. Notice there's a byline here. If the student does not attend the ARC meeting, the public agency must take other steps to ensure the student's preference and interest are considered. And if you've heard me before in anything, notice that says, has the public agency taken those steps? Those have to be documented. So if not one, then the other. So this is one of the first things that we look at when we're looking at your files and we're looking at your ARC meeting notes of things of a meeting that happens with a child related to your facility. So during that time that they're in your charge and we're reviewing that file, or if you've adopted an IEP from a previous facility, keep that in mind, that we have to look to see whether they've been invited and if that purpose is the consideration of post-secondary goals and transition services. So students must be invited prior to the meeting notice and not just pulled out of class to attend. There has to be documentation. So again, it can't just be like, oh my goodness, we forgot to invite Johnny. We've got to go get him. It has to be done beforehand. There has to be proper notice that occurs to everyone, and he or she has to be included in that. If the student is unable or unwilling to attend, make sure documentation exists that the student's interests and preferences were considered in another way. If you don't document it, it didn't happen. And please make sure that makes your job so much easier. That makes our job so much easier. Please make sure that you're documenting things appropriately. All right, let's look at GS2. And by the by, there's going to be a lot of words on some of these documents, but I wanted to make sure that, number one, that's one of the reasons I included the PDF so that everyone could look at that. and see this. I also wanted to make sure that you all knew specifically what we're looking for, because we don't want to veil anything. We don't want to hide anything. Are students with disabilities required to be included in state, notice the second one, and district-wide programs? And district-wide programs. Do these students receive individual appropriate accommodations and alternate assessments? So, are the students with disabilities required to be included in state and district-wide programs? Examples of those would be if your district does MAP testing, ACT, all of those things, they have to receive appropriate accommodations, and they also have to take place or take part in those district-wide assessments. So what I'm telling you is, if the high school does it and you're a correctional facility within that, all of your students are supposed to take part in those same assessments, including special education. So again, there can't be two sets of things. It has to be accessible to every single kid. There has to be an equitable education accessible for those kids, particularly with special education. Do those students, are they receiving appropriate individual accommodations as a result? And do they receive access to alternate assessments if they qualify? So again, if it spells it out in the IEP, and if you were in the other session, you heard me say this, this is a federally legal binding document, an IEP is. So you have to make sure, if it says in there that they are alternate assessment students, they have to have access on all assessments to the alternate assessments if they qualify. So that's not an option. We're not playing Monopoly. You can't pass go and not collect $200. They have to be afforded access to that. So indicator 3. GS3, do personnel who provide special education and related services to students in the facility meet the IDEA's personnel qualification requirements? That means that staff are appropriately and adequately trained and prepared. Are you certified? And yes, we do go check to see if you're certified and appropriately certified. So it is the responsibility. So if you've got a certification that has expired, that can be an issue. If you've got an instructor whose certification has expired, that's why you've got to make sure, particularly if you're an administrator on this call today, that you're keeping track of that. And whether you're a master teacher or a principal or an administrator, all of those things have to be kept up to date. Have the content knowledge and the skills to serve students with disabilities in correctional facilities. You have to be teaching within the content. Now we can talk about alternative certification within the content knowledge and skills to serve students with disabilities in correctional facilities. So again, are you certified and are you qualified to teach the students in the classroom? Whether that's a special education certification or whether that's a regular education certification, you have to be properly certified to provide instruction to those students. GS4, remember what I said about having a lot of words on a page, but this is probably one of the most important ones, and I'm going to be perfectly honest with you. This is one of those that through the years, we've seen a lot of folks have that haven't necessarily followed this the way that they're supposed to. Our child find policies and procedures to address identifying, locating, and evaluating eligible students with disabilities who need special education and related services used in the KECSAC facility. Public agencies, and this is a federal law, must have child find policies and procedures in effect that ensure all age-eligible students, that's 3 to 21, with disabilities, including those in correctional facilities, who need special education-related services, are identified, located, and evaluated regardless of the severity of the disability. So just because, and you all have heard, if you were in the other session, you heard me say this, just because kids in high school, that doesn't mean we stop looking for suspected disabilities. Just because a kid's in an alternative setting, Doesn't mean we don't keep evaluating them and looking to see, can they qualify or should they qualify for specially designed instruction. Public agencies must have child find policies and procedures that ensure all age-eligible students, including those in correctional facilities who require special education-related services, are evaluated regardless of the severity of their disability, and that is the Kentucky Administrative Regulation PSAID. So again, not just a federal regulation, also a mirrored state regulation. So it's doubly important to make sure that's looking for students having a quality evaluative system, including the same system that exists in every other school in your district. That's response to intervention, that's multi-tiered systems of support, that's looking to see, do they qualify for speech language, whatever that might be. You're still responsible to make sure that you're constantly looking for if that child has a disability that hasn't been identified. So again, child find, child find, child find. And I'm going to tell you the answer that we get more often than not is we've got a folder around here somewhere with the form. What are you doing with that form? How do you know that a child, if you suspect a disability, what is your responsibility? How are you supposed to address that need in that kid? Again, it's important that we're constantly looking and we're evaluating, because here's the thing. If I had a difficulty, whenever that case may be, I still should be eligible to receive the help that I need. Again, you've got that responsibility in all students. If they haven't graduated high school, haven't received a diploma, age 3 through 21, that's still a requirement that comes into play. All right, GS5 and this is one of those tiny script ones, so I apologize. The bigger screen is to my right. Are responsible efforts made to ensure the assignment of a surrogate parent in accordance with the IDEA selection criteria not more than 30 days after it's determined that a student with a disability in a KECSAC facility needs a surrogate parent. Please make sure that you understand the surrogacy responsibilities and first of all, that you have a policy in place for surrogacy. Number 2, that you know who can be and who can't be a surrogate parent, who can serve as a representative for that student in the place of a parent. So if a student is court ordered into your facility, is a guardian ad litem or has a guardian ad litem or so on, who can actually represent that student in an ARC. Don't make an assumption. Please don't make an assumption, because doing so is not giving that parent or that guardian the access that they're allowed by federal and state law to make sure that the child is appropriately represented, and in doing so is protected by the guardianship. So again, don't make, and particularly with guardian ad litems, let me just say this as a former principal, don't make the mistake of making an assumption that guardian ad litem is qualified to be the representative for that kid. And again, I'm not necessarily just talking about surrogacy here, but what I'm saying to you is make sure the appropriate person, and I'm going to tell you, if they've got a parent who is in prison and that parent still has, unless those rights have been terminated, they still have the right to take a part in that child's education. So you've got to make all reasonable efforts to make sure that that child is appropriately represented in an ARC meeting. So, and again, and I would tell you, as I told the other group, if you have questions, your director of special ed in your local district is your first person you need to reach out to. We'll talk about, and you've got co-ops, you've got us, folks. And please don't feel like if you call me, I'm going to say nada boo-boo that you made a mistake. Please, I would much rather you reach out to me, and I promise I won't. unless I absolutely positively have to, I won't slap your hand. I'm here to answer questions. That's part of my job, is to make sure that children are represented appropriately and receive the services to which they're qualified. So again, ensure that a child has the surrogate parent that they're entitled to, and that is appropriate under law. So the district, again, this is kind of what I was alluding to a moment ago, must have a method for determining whether a student needs a surrogate parent and for assigning that parent to the student. The IDEA also permits a judge overseeing the case of a student who is the ward of the state to appoint a surrogate parent. Public agencies must not assume all students with disabilities in correctional facilities need a surrogate parent. That's what I was talking about. So rather, a surrogate parent acts in the place of a student's parent only when the parent cannot be identified, the parent cannot be located after reasonable efforts. And I'm going to tell you, reasonable efforts have to go a long way, and they have to be documented. And the student is a ward of the state under the laws of that state, or the student is an unaccompanied or homeless youth as defined under McKinney-Vento. So are reasonable efforts made to ensure the assignment of a surrogate parent in accordance again? So surrogate parents cannot be an employee of the department, the local educational agency, the district, or any other public agency, DJJ, so on, that is involved in the education or the care of the child. Notice what that says. Additionally, surrogate parents shall not have any personal or professional interest that conflicts with the interest of the child, and shall have the knowledge and skills that ensure adequate representation of that child. So again, I would refer you back to that prior slide where we talked about that policy that you're required to have, each district is required to have, each district, for determining when a student needs a surrogate parent and assigning someone as the surrogate parent. And I can tell you all, this is one you sometimes you may have to go down a lot of rabbit holes to make sure that you're crossing your T's and dotting your I's where this one's concerned. So I would highly recommend that you dig into your district policy and make sure your district has policy on surrogacy. So GS6, how does it ensure that all procedural safeguards and protections under the IDEA are extended to eligible students with disabilities and their parents? So unless the state has opted to transfer those parental rights at the age of majority under the KAR, parents do not lose their rights under the IDEA when their child is placed in a correctional facility, even if that student has been convicted as an adult and incarcerated in an adult prison. So again, those rights don't terminate just because the child has been charged as an adult and is held in an adult prison. Parents of students in correctional facilities are entitled to receive prior written notice and procedural safeguards. Remember the example I gave a moment ago about if a child's parent is incarcerated or MIA, you still have to make all reasonable efforts to make sure that that parent receives prior written notice of the ARC and procedural safeguards. And I'm going to tell you in very uncertain terms here that if we start looking at a district and it keeps saying, well, parent waived procedure or waived notice, parent waived notice. They said, if we see those patterns, that's going to cause us to start to see, was every reasonable effort made to contact the appropriate representative for that child? So please make sure that you're doing what you're supposed to be doing. So the district or other public agency must provide the parents with prior written notice a reasonable time before the public agency proposes or refuses to initiate or change the identification, evaluation, or educational placement of a child with disability or the provision of FAPE to a child These notices must be written in language understandable to the general public and provided in the native language of the parent or other mode of communication used by the parent unless it is not feasible to do so. Correctional facilities may not assume the role of the parent under the IDEA and may not, for example, provide or refuse consent for a student's initial evaluation or re-eval, or provide, reviews, or revoke consent for services or serve as the parent on an IEP team. So correctional facilities cannot assume that role of that parent. Not allowed. It may be difficult for some of those parents to participate. You notice this keeps popping up. If the correctional facility is not located near the parent's residence, nevertheless, the parent's participation requirements are there. So there's alternate means of taking part, whether that's by phone, whether that's by particularly now with Skype and Teams and all these other options. So you're responsible for making sure that that parent takes part. So this is another one of those. How is it ensured that there's no undue interruption in the provision of special education and related services when students are confined to KECSAC facilities? In other words, how is it ensured that requirements for IEPs of transfer students are met for in-state and out-of-state transfer students with IEPs? Out-of-state too, not just in-state, who transfer into the facility in the same year, including requirements for providing FAPE and through services comparable to those described in the student's IEP from the previous public agency. In other words, if a student transfers into your facility, there is a responsibility to make sure that you reach out to that prior facility, whether in-state or out-of-state, to make sure to determine if that child has an IEP or receives specially designed instruction. So again, the rules for governing responsibility apply for FAPE, apply when they transfer from one to another. Now, I know, you can have a kid on Tuesday, they get transferred to another one on Thursday, they get transferred to another one on Monday, and they're back on Tuesday. So what I'm saying to you is, and I hope you've got some good records folks in your offices, or if you are the records person, please make sure that you're getting these records as soon as you can. Don't wait a week. Don't wait 2 weeks, because you're responsible for enacting that IEP whenever possible. The failure of the public agency to obtain records promptly can interfere with the student's responsibility to receive a free appropriate public education and to receive credits towards graduation. And you all know transcripts, and IC has made this a lot better, and those transfers in IC have made it a lot better. But you all know it's a lot harder, particularly as kids get transferred from here to here and you've done a transfer request. Sometimes it may be as simple as making a phone call. You can ask the kid, and you all know sometimes the kids don't know whether they receive special education services. I would recommend, if there's a question, that you make a phone call to that prior facility, or the prior facility if you know it, to see, did this child receive special education? If so, what were they? And get on the stick as quickly as possible to get those records transferred to you. All right. And I know this is a lot, folks, so I apologize. So the new public agency in which the student enrolls must take proper steps to make sure that you're getting those records. I think you're getting the gist of it here, that you've got to make sure that these records get there, and make sure that that student, if they have an IEP, receives the services to which they're entitled. However, if after taking reasonable steps, the new agency is not able to obtain the IEP from the parent or the public agency, the new public agency must at a minimum place the student in the regular education program, conduct an evaluation, and make an eligibility determination. If the new public agency determines an evaluation is necessary, Goes back to that child find, and that's why it's so important that you've got those child find policies. So if you suspect a kid has a disability and they haven't been identified, you've got to take the steps to make sure that that occurs. So although the new public agency is not required to provide special education related services because it'd be unable to determine what constitutes comparable for students without an IEP, excluding the student from all educational services is not permissible. So you can't just take them out and set them over here until you know what's going on with them. They have to receive educational services from moment one inside your facility. If they're going on at that time, I should say it that way. Even if the public agency is unable, so again, the impetus is here, you got to make sure that you determine whether they need the assistance or not. So are there policies and practices and procedures in place to make sure that those records transfers happen? We're going to look at those policies and procedures. I can guarantee you that we're going to look and see, is there a policy that says when we get a student in, this is what happens. When we transfer a student to another facility or they exit, this is what happens. Are there policies and practices in place to assure that that's done in a timely manner? That's what the essence of this question is. All right, I'm going to stop there for just a second. I'm going to take a quick drink and I'm going to see of soda if anyone has any questions.
Jared, there have been some questions in the chat. I've been trying to answer those.
Okay. Is there any that you haven't got to, Jackie?
I think maybe just some clarification related to a parent in a correctional facility and how they can maybe send that meeting invitation to those parents.
Let's see here. I'm just trying to look back here and just make sure that I'm answering all those. Can the court worker serve as a surrogate? Again, Sally, and by the way, I knew Sally was going to give us some good questions. You always want to refer back to that surrogacy policy and to that KAR. So you want to, they have to not have that conflict of interest. Typically what most districts have, Sally, is they have a list that says, this is who can serve as a surrogate parent. Typically it's a retired person in the community. A lot of times it will be a retired special education teacher because they tend to be the best advocates for those kids. So the district policy really is what governs that more than anything. Let's see. Jackie, did you address the one about the rights available in multiple languages?
Yes, I mentioned that the co-ops have those available.
Okay.
They do have a website for that. I can try to post it to see if it will come up in there, but they have I think like 12 different languages available. Okay.
Yeah. And KES teachers, you've addressed that. Okay. All righty. I don't think you were denied KES teachers, but I can check it here when I'm done if you don't mind. So I'll do that here towards the end if you don't mind. All right, so I'm going to keep trucking here, and I'm sorry I missed the questions in the chat. It had frozen on me. Let's go through the PAs, and then we'll kind of circle back around. What process is used to work with individuals most likely to come into contact with students in KECSAC facilities to ensure age-eligible students suspected of disabilities are identified? It's child find again. If you all haven't noticed, that gets touched on a few times in all this. You have to have child find policies, and it has to be the same as you would any kid in any school in the district. It has to be the same, and that's, again, going back and talking about mental health services. That's talking about particularly, and I want to make sure that you are aware, and I hope someone has talked to you about the new social emotional requirements in the state, because that's another key piece that's going to be a part going forward of those requirements in school districts. So I hope that you all have taken part in training with your local districts on social emotional learning and having those plans in place, because You should be included as much as any other school in that district. So, Justin, their question is, from moment one, when they get into that facility, they're still entitled to receive those services. So if they're in quarantine, they're still supposed to be receiving educational services, whether that's remotely, which we would have to be remotely if they're in quarantine. So again, they're entitled to receive those services, whether regular education or special education, from moment one inside that door. So if you've got educational services being offered at other spots in that facility, they have to be afforded the same opportunity to participate. All right. So I'm going to hope maybe that Jackie can address some of these questions in chat, if you don't mind, Jackie, and we've got a little bit ways to go here. So what's the process used to ensure initial evaluations take place within the Kentucky established timelines of 60 days? Once you figure out that a child, or you suspect a disability, you've got 60 days from that initial evaluation to make sure that everything gets done, that all the T's get crossed, that all the evaluations get done, all the progress monitoring, everything. So again, child find, child find, child find. If y'all haven't noticed, I keep saying that. It's not just me, it's in this language. And this is not something that Jared Sloan is telling you. This is something the federal government and Kentucky regulations set out. So again, the evaluation of a student suspected of having disability must occur once parental consent has been obtained, even if the student will not be in the facility long enough to complete the process. So you don't just stop because you know a student's going to be transferred. Until the last moment they leave, you're going to continue that process. It's supposed to continue in the next facility. So if you suspect a child has a disability, that responsibility to initiate the evaluation doesn't go away. Even if they're transferred from facility to facility, that evaluation should continue facility to facility. So as a child is transferred, as they come in, if you've got a child who was in process of evaluation at a previous one, again, that's why it's important to talk and communicate and get those records from that prior facility. Let's see here. We've got a 60-day timeline in Kentucky. It has to occur as expeditiously as possible, as quickly as possible. There cannot be stated minimums for amount of time that a child has to stay in an RTI process to be evaluated. Districts are, and that's OSEP Memo 1107. You cannot say, and this is even outside of a facility, that a child has to stay in RTI for 6 weeks before they can be evaluated. They're evaluated based on the need of the child. Let's see here. How is it ensured that all personnel necessary to carry out Part B are appropriately and adequately prepared? So again, states must maintain, and their public agencies, in other words, that's that certification question. That the personnel providing special education and related services, that public school education teachers, special education in correctional facilities must meet Kentucky certification criteria, and related services personnel and paraprofessionals in correctional facilities must meet state qualifications. In other words, you've got to have certified people working with your kids at every step of the way. So if you've got a kid who qualifies for a special education aid, then that aid has to be certified per Kentucky requirements. So they have to be vetted through the local district. Has to still continue. And it has to be provided if it's needed for the kid. How is it ensured that non-educational training staff serving students with disabilities are included in professional development activities regarding the IDEA, including positive behavior intervention supports, discipline procedures, and cross-agency staff discussions? I want you to read this closely. Public agencies should consider non-educational training staff in professional development activities regarding IDEA, including PBIS and discipline procedures. They should provide opportunities for discussion across agency staff. Notice I'm not just saying school staff. I'm saying if you work with a kid, you should be included in any trainings related to special education. If you help with the special education kid, you're considered school personnel through that the memorandum of understanding and the memorandum of agreement. You're still responsible. That if you're in a DJJ facility, you should be receiving the same training that somebody in a local school district. If you're providing instructional assistance to a kid, you're still supposed to receive that training. So even though indicator PA4 is going to be reviewed by the department, it's not considered by OSEP to be a compliance indicator. We still have to monitor it though. So let me go to the next one here, and this is really important. And I'm going to clarify this. I want you all to pay very close attention to this next section on physical restraint and seclusion and the regulation, because there's some very important information here that I want to make sure that's crystal clear. All school personnel are required to be trained in state administrative regulations and school district policies and procedures regarding physical restraint and seclusion, including annual training to provide PBIS. The training of PBIS should be to increase appropriate student behaviors, decrease inappropriate behaviors, and physical restraint and seclusion should only be implemented by a core team of appropriately trained individuals where there is imminent danger to self or others. And this is the definition of school personnel. If your facility has a memorandum of agreement, you're considered school personnel during the school day. Shall not impose on any student at any time mechanical restraint, chemical restraint, adverse behavioral interventions, physical restraint that is life-threatening, prone or supine restraint, physical restraint if they know that the physical restraint is contraindicated based on the student's disability, healthcare needs, or medical or psychiatric condition. During the school day, you cannot use, outside of the school day is a discussion among you all. Inside the school day, this is what governs you. When you sign that memorandum of agreement with the local district, this is what you're responsible to do under the law. You cannot use any of these types of restraints with students during the course of a day. Keep in mind that inappropriate or overuse of physical restraint and seclusion could still result in a denial of FAPE. Have you noticed that that's our other catchphrase? So we make sure that all IEP requirements are met. So do you comply with the requirement for special factors relating to positive behavior interventions and support? Other strategies to address behavior in developing, reviewing, and revising IEPs of students with disabilities whose behavior impedes learning or that of others. So in other words, you have to evaluate to see, is the behavior a factor in the disability of the student? So is there an effect? So special factors must include that they're particularly relevant requirement to consider the use of PBIS and other strategies to address behavior with those students. So I want to, and we're running out of time, so if you all notice I'm speeding up a little bit, that's why. But I want to make sure that you've know that you have access to this, to these slides. There must be a continuum of placement options available to ensure the needs of all students are met, including more restrictive settings when needed. If a child needs a resource room for special education, they must have access to a resource room for special education. That cannot be limited by administrative convenience, cannot be limited by money, cannot be limited by space. It has to be provided if it's determined by the ARC that that is what's the most appropriate for the kid, they have to receive the opportunity or access to that continuum of services. So it is solely the responsibility of the ARC to make individualized placement and not place all students in the same setting. Has to be based on the kid's needs. So again, this is kind of one of those talks about the post-secondary goals for training. In other words, you have to have that transition in place, that transition meeting, and that they have post-secondary goals that are appropriate and that outline their how the classes that they're taking, that they have the access to the classes that are going to help them move along, and that they have the ability to take part in the curriculum that any other kid has the opportunity in the district. So the public agency must take steps to ensure that the student's preferences are considered if the student doesn't attend that IEP meeting. We talked about that a little bit earlier. Finally, the IEP must document with not later than 1 year before the student reaches the age of majority. The IEP must document the student has been informed of the student's rights under the IDEA, and if any, that will transfer the student on reaching the age of majority. So whatever that age of majority is, which is 18 typically, then they have to receive those rights. So code of conduct. A student with a disability cannot be treated any differently than a student who doesn't have that. And that IEP has to be followed when you're considering students with disabilities. So again, make sure that there's not a different treatment for this set of kids as opposed to this set of kids. Everything is as equitable as possible. I'm going to talk here about this one a little bit more, and I know we're running out of time, but I want to make sure we talk about this one. A student with a disability who violates a code of conduct is entitled to protections afforded to all students with disabilities related to disciplinary procedures. This includes provisions related to change of placement, in other words, least restrictive environment, manifestation determinations, and provisions of services beginning with the 11th cumulative day of removal in a school year. When are they removed from the classroom? And again, that's going to follow them facility to facility to facility. So you may get a kid who has been removed in excess of 10 days, greater than 10 days, who is a special education kid. A manifestation determination has to be held. It's not an option. Make yourself familiar with manifestation determinations. If you are not, this is one of the biggest issues that we see. Please make sure that you're familiar with the requirements for special education students and manifestation determinations and how to track the cumulative amount of time that they have been removed from their least restrictive environment, and that you are documenting in Infinite Campus as required all removals of students and all disciplinary procedures that take place with students in Infinite Campus, not somewhere else. You can document it somewhere else too, but it has to be put in Infinite Campus. If they're a child in a Kentucky school setting, it has to be an Infinite Campus. This disciplinary procedures apply regardless of whether the student is subject to discipline or removed to restricted settings such as confinement to the student's cell or living quarters or lockdown units. That is a removal from the least restrictive environment. So if the IEP says they're receiving this in a classroom or in a resource room and they're placed, like the question about the quarantine earlier, if they're there, then that's considered a removal from the least restrictive environment. That has to be documented as such in Infinite Campus. So again, still has to be documented. Information is sent to students with disabilities and their parents regarding reentry after release. We've talked a little bit about that, so make sure that this is an area that we're talking about addressing transition and reentry, and we'll provide recommendations but this is not a compliance indicator. So, but it is something. Oh, sorry, it is something that we address and we look at. You have to make sure that those kids have reentry plans, vocational and life skills training, behavior management, directive academic instruction. So how can you tell students about what's going on? And some districts, some facilities rather, have a packet and they talk, or they have like a person, a counselor of sorts, or a youth worker who meets with these kids and goes over this. It can be done home visits, information sharing, collaboration with community-based organizations, engagement fairs, print, so on and so forth, community-wide campaigns. Make sure that they understand if they leave, once they leave your facility, what they can go back to. All right, so I do want to just talk really quickly here. IEP considerations. Make sure that all of these items here on the screen are addressed. And I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to just go ahead and cut and say, if you have questions, contact us. There's some other slides that I just passed by. Please review those. You can contact us at the department. There's several guidance documents out there. Your special education cooperatives, and I think Jackie actually put a list in the chat over there too. Those are resources for you as well. The Exceptional Children's Conference, the CEC Conference for Kentucky, is taking place November 21st through 23rd. And if you have questions, Irma is available. I am available. And I'm going to see if we have any questions here at the end. And Jackie, maybe you could step in and see if there's any that I haven't addressed or that we need to revisit.
I think all from the chat are okay.
Okay. Does anyone have any additional questions? And I know we've talked about a lot. It's a lot of fast talking, folks, and I apologize. This is a lot of stuff to cover in a short amount of time. Kathy, I just approved you to view that. I don't know why. Some districts have different settings, so. Sally, it is. Let me put this link in the chat again. So again, that's today's presentation. It should be accessible to everyone, but unfortunately, sometimes folks have different blocks and things. Questions, comments, concerns? Alrighty, folks. I'm going to stick around just a minute or so in the room here in case anybody has any questions, and I'll just keep monitoring the chat and whatever. Appreciate you all taking time today to learn about this. It's a lot, particularly if you're an administrator. Again, reach out for help. That's why we're here. Thanks so much, and you'll have a great rest of the afternoon.
Great. Thank you, Jared. Appreciate it. Thanks everybody for being here. Your next session starts at 2:15 Eastern time, and that is our final session of the day. We'll start with some student awards and then move into our final closing speaker. Thanks for being here. We'll see you again at 2:15.